Imagine being lost in Yellowstone, only to be saved by a black panther. Sounds unreal? This story will move you. Stay to discover Shadow's heroic act, her bond with Emily, and the life-changing decisions ahead. Like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The wind swept gently through the tall pines lining the narrow dirt road of Yellowstone's remote northern reserve, carrying with it the crisp scent of wildflowers and pine needles. Ethan Carter, a seasoned park ranger with years of experience patrolling the wilderness, had warned many visitors about the unforgiving solitude of this area. Yet, as the morning sun broke through the canopy of trees, casting long, golden shadows, he would never have imagined what this day had in store. Deeper in the woods, a small figure sat trembling near a patch of wild grass. Emily, just 3 years old, clung tightly to her knees, her tiny body trembling with every gust of wind. Her face was streaked with tears, her blonde curls matted against her forehead, and her small pink shoes caked with dirt. She was visibly terrified, her eyes darting to every rustling leaf and distant sound. It was as if the forest, vast and alive, had swallowed her whole. From the shadows of the thick foliage, another figure emerged. Silent and sleek, Shadow, a black panther, padded gracefully toward the child. Her coat gleamed in the dim light, her muscles rippling beneath her jet-black fur. To an untrained eye, she was a predator, a silent hunter whose presence could strike fear into any living creature. But Shadow's gaze held something different as she approached Emily: curiosity, perhaps even a hint of protectiveness. Her piercing yellow eyes locked onto the child, assessing her as she whimpered softly. Shadow stepped closer, her massive paws making barely a sound on the soft earth. Emily looked up, her tear-streaked face freezing in fear as she spotted the imposing animal. Her lips quivered, and she let out a small gasp, retreating slightly but too scared to scream. Shadow paused, tilting her head as if to say, "I won't hurt you." Slowly, she lowered her body to the ground, lying just a few feet away from the child, her tail curling protectively around her. The moment stretched on in tense silence, broken only by Emily's muffled sobs. Then, a distant howl echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable growl of a coyote. Shadow's ears perked up. She rose quickly, her body taut with alertness. Emily instinctively clutched the small stuffed rabbit she carried, pressing it to her chest. In a flash, Shadow turned toward the sound, positioning herself between Emily and the direction of the noise. Her instincts as both a predator and protector kicked in. Emily, sensing the shift in energy, remained still, her eyes wide and fixated on the panther. Minutes later, the sound of twigs snapping grew louder. Emerging from the shadows, a scrawny coyote with matted fur and hungry eyes appeared, its focus locking onto the small, vulnerable child. It bared its teeth, growling low as it crept closer, its steps cautious but determined. Shadow growled back, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills through the air. The standoff was intense. Shadow crouched low, her muscles coiled like springs, ready to pounce. The coyote hesitated but didn't retreat, its hunger overriding any sense of caution. Finally, with a sharp snarl, Shadow launched herself forward. The battle was fierce but brief. The panther's strength and agility overpowered the smaller predator, and with a final, warning growl, she sent the coyote retreating into the woods, yelping as it fled. As the dust settled, Shadow returned to Emily, her chest rising and falling with exertion. The child reached out a trembling hand, brushing it gently against the panther's paw. Shadow didn't flinch. Instead, she lowered her head, her eyes softening as she allowed the small human to touch her. A few hours later, Ethan arrived. His patrol brought him down the secluded path, his truck rumbling softly over the uneven terrain. Spotting movement near the roadside, he brought the vehicle to a halt. His heart skipped a beat as he took in the surreal sight. A tiny child sitting calmly beside a panther that should not have been there. Shadow stood protectively, her eyes fixed on Ethan, ready to defend the child if necessary. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, stepping cautiously out of the truck, his hand instinctively moving toward his tranquilizer gun. But something stopped him. The panther wasn't behaving aggressively. In fact, the bond between the animal and the child was undeniable. Ethan crouched down, speaking softly. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his voice calm but laced with worry. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Emily didn't respond. Her wide blue eyes flicked between Ethan and Shadow. Sensing the tension, Shadow let out a low growl, a warning to Ethan to approach carefully. Ethan raised his hands in surrender. "Easy, girl," he said gently. "I'm here to help." He slowly inched closer, watching as Emily hesitated before reaching for him. Shadow, as if understanding, stepped aside, allowing Ethan to lift the trembling child into his arms. "Where did you come from?" Ethan whispered, holding Emily tightly as she clung to him. He glanced back at Shadow, who stood watching him, her golden eyes unblinking. For a moment, man and beast locked eyes, an unspoken understanding passing between them. With Emily in his arms and Shadow trailing silently behind, Ethan returned to his truck, already grappling with the questions swirling in his mind. This was only the beginning of a story that would change all their lives. Years before the strange and fateful encounter with Emily, Ethan Carter had already been deeply connected to Yellowstone's wilderness and its many secrets. He was a ranger who didn't just patrol the land. He lived and breathed it. His days were spent ensuring that the balance of this ecosystem remained undisturbed, and his nights were often consumed by thoughts of the poachers who threatened its fragile harmony. It was during one of those nights, about 5 years ago, that Ethan first encountered Shadow. The memory was seared into his mind like a scar. He had been responding to a report of suspicious activity near the southern perimeter of the reserve, a hotspot for illegal hunting. Armed with a flashlight, a tranquilizer rifle, and a heavy heart from countless previous incidents, Ethan ventured into the dense woods, where shadows played tricks on even the most experienced ranger. The sound of a gunshot cracked through the night air, sharp and final. Ethan froze for a moment, his ears straining to pinpoint the direction. He sprinted toward the sound, his boots crunching against the forest floor, adrenaline coursing through his veins. When he arrived at a small clearing, the sight before him was both devastating and infuriating. A female black panther lay lifeless on the ground, her sleek body riddled with bullet wounds. Beside her, 2 men stood over the kill, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They were laughing, congratulating each other on their trophy. The sight ignited a rage within Ethan, but before he could act, his eyes caught movement near the body. A tiny black cub, no more than a few weeks old, was nudging its mother, letting out weak, pitiful cries. Ethan's heart broke in an instant. "Hey!" Ethan's voice boomed through the clearing as he stepped into view, his flashlight blinding the poachers. The men turned, startled, their hands instinctively reaching for their rifles. Ethan raised his own weapon, not a firearm but his tranquilizer rifle. "You're on federal land," Ethan said, his voice low and firm. "Drop your weapons now." One of the poachers, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. "And what are you gonna do about it, Ranger? You think that toy gun's gonna stop us?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Try me," he said, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You've got about 10 seconds before I call every ranger in this park and have you surrounded." The poachers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Finally, with a string of curses, they dropped their rifles and bolted into the woods. Ethan could have pursued them, but his attention was fixed on the cub, now trembling beside its mother's body. He approached slowly, kneeling beside the tiny panther. "Hey, little one," he murmured, his voice soft. The cub looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, its cries growing louder. Ethan carefully scooped the cub into his arms, its small body fitting easily against his chest. "You're safe now," he whispered. But as he looked down at the cub, Ethan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Raising a wild animal, especially a predator like a black panther, was a responsibility few could handle. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave the cub alone in a world that had already been so cruel to it. Over the next few months, Ethan dedicated himself to Shadow's care. He named her for her dark, sleek coat and the way she moved silently, almost invisibly, through the shadows. Raising her was no simple task. He had to navigate a maze of legal and ethical challenges, keeping her presence hidden from most of his colleagues and the public. At first, Shadow was weak and fragile, refusing to eat or move much. Ethan spent countless nights coaxing her to drink from a bottle, warming her with blankets, and speaking to her in soft tones. Slowly, she began to trust him. Her strength returned, and her playful nature emerged. Ethan marveled at her intelligence and agility, but he never forgot that she was, at her core, a wild animal. As Shadow grew, Ethan knew he couldn't keep her confined forever. She belonged in the wild, where she could live as nature intended. He began the painstaking process of reintroducing her to the reserve, teaching her how to hunt and survive on her own. It was a bittersweet journey. Every step forward brought him closer to losing the bond they had built. The day he released her fully into the wild was one of the hardest of his life. Shadow, now a sleek and powerful adult, stood at the edge of the woods, looking back at him one last time. Their eyes met, and Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Then, without a sound, she disappeared into the forest. In the years that followed, Ethan spotted Shadow occasionally on his patrols. She always stayed at a distance, but he liked to think she recognized him. He often wondered if she had formed her own family, if she was thriving in the wilderness he loved so much. And now, seeing her protect Emily with such fierce determination, Ethan realized that Shadow hadn't just survived, she had flourished. She had become a guardian, not just of the forest but of something far more fragile and precious. A lost little girl who had somehow found her way into both their lives. The early morning light filtered through the dense canopy of Yellowstone's remote wilderness, casting dappled shadows on the dirt road where Emily sat clutching her stuffed rabbit. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves in the wind, but to the 3-year-old, it all felt overwhelming and alien. Her small frame shivered, more from fear than from the cool morning air. She didn't understand where she was or why she was alone. She only knew that she was scared. Shadow, the sleek black panther who had silently emerged from the woods, lay nearby, her golden eyes fixed on the child. She stayed low to the ground, her powerful body tense but unmoving, exuding both calm and alertness. Emily had stopped crying by now, soothed, in part, by the strange presence of the big cat. There was something about Shadow, her stillness, her quiet strength, that made the girl feel safe, even if she didn't fully understand why. But the peace of the moment was shattered by a new sound. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Shadow's spine. Her ears perked up, and her tail twitched as she scanned the surrounding woods. The growl came again, closer this time. Shadow stood, her muscles rippling under her jet-black coat, and placed herself squarely between Emily and the direction of the noise. A coyote emerged from the underbrush, its scraggly frame and sunken eyes a testament to its desperation. Yellowstone's winters were harsh, and food was scarce. The coyote's focus locked on Emily, who was small, vulnerable, and alone, or so it thought. It bared its teeth, letting out a sharp bark, a clear warning that it intended to approach. Emily whimpered, clutching her rabbit tighter. "Kitty," she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at Shadow. Shadow didn't move. She stood her ground, her ears flattened against her head, and let out a low growl of her own. The sound was deep and resonant, a clear message to the coyote. This is not your prey. The coyote hesitated for a moment, its yellowed eyes flicking between the child and the panther. But hunger outweighed caution, and it began to creep closer, its movements slow and calculated. Shadow crouched low, her claws digging into the dirt as she prepared to strike. Her growl grew louder, reverberating through the air like a warning bell. When the coyote lunged, Shadow sprang into action. She leaped forward with astonishing speed, her powerful muscles propelling her through the air. The two animals collided in a flurry of fur and snarls, their battle playing out just feet from where Emily sat frozen in fear. Shadow swiped with her claws, her strikes precise and controlled, while the coyote snapped its jaws, trying desperately to fight back. "Kitty," Emily cried out, tears streaming down her face as she watched the struggle. Her voice was small but piercing, filled with both fear and concern for the panther who had become her silent protector. The fight didn't last long. Shadow's strength and agility far outmatched the coyote's. With a final, powerful blow, she sent the smaller animal tumbling to the ground. The coyote scrambled to its feet, its body heaving with exhaustion, and let out a pitiful yelp before retreating into the forest. Shadow watched it disappear, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the fight. She let out one last growl, a warning that echoed through the trees, before turning back to Emily. The little girl was crying now, her face buried in her stuffed rabbit. Shadow approached slowly, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. She lay down in front of Emily, her golden eyes softening as she rested her massive head on her paws. The child looked up, her tear-streaked face meeting Shadow's gaze. Tentatively, she reached out with one small hand and placed it gently on the panther's sleek fur. "Kitty," Emily whispered again, her voice barely audible. Shadow didn't move, allowing the girl to touch her. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a fragile bond forged in the chaos of the moment. Several minutes passed in silence, the tension in the air gradually dissipating. Emily leaned against Shadow's side, her tiny frame dwarfed by the panther's massive body. Shadow remained still, her ears swiveling to catch every sound in the forest. She was alert, ready to defend the child again if necessary. From a distance, the faint sound of a truck engine broke through the quiet. Shadow's ears perked up, and she rose to her feet, her gaze fixed in the direction of the noise. Emily looked up, confused, as the panther moved to stand protectively in front of her. The truck came into view moments later, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. Ethan stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he surveyed the scene. His eyes widened in shock when he saw Emily sitting on the ground, the panther standing watch over her. "Emily?" Ethan called out, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. He moved closer cautiously, keeping his eyes on Shadow. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Emily turned toward him, her face lighting up at the sound of a friendly voice. "Kitty saved me," she said simply, pointing at Shadow. Ethan glanced at the panther, who remained still, her eyes locked on him. He could see the tension in her body, the way she was ready to react if he made a wrong move. He raised his hands in a calming gesture. "It's okay," he said softly, more to Shadow than to Emily. "I'm here to help." Shadow seemed to understand. She stepped back slightly, giving Ethan the space to scoop Emily into his arms. The little girl clung to him tightly, burying her face in his shoulder. Ethan looked at Shadow, his voice low and filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, even though he wasn't sure she could comprehend his words. But in that moment, as the panther turned and melted back into the forest, he felt certain that she understood everything. The ride back to the ranger station was unusually quiet. Emily sat nestled in Ethan's arms, her face pressed against his chest. Every now and then, she would clutch her stuffed rabbit a little tighter, but she didn't cry or speak. Her exhaustion was apparent, and Ethan let her rest, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up alone in the middle of Yellowstone's wilderness? And why had Shadow, of all creatures, stayed to protect her? The ranger station was a modest log cabin tucked away in a clearing, its rustic exterior blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine wood and coffee, a comforting contrast to the harsh wilderness outside. Ethan gently set Emily down on a worn leather couch in the corner, covering her with a wool blanket he kept for emergencies. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. He walked over to his desk, where a bank of monitors displayed live footage from various camera traps scattered throughout the reserve. These cameras were primarily used to monitor wildlife activity and detect illegal poachers, but now they would serve another purpose, finding out how Emily had come to be here. Ethan rewound the footage from the camera nearest to where he'd found her. The grainy black and white video showed Shadow emerging from the woods, her sleek form cutting through the early morning mist. Moments later, the tiny figure of Emily appeared, clutching her rabbit and looking around nervously. But it was the next part that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. A woman stepped into frame, her movements hurried and frantic. She was young, possibly in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She glanced around nervously before kneeling down and placing Emily near the fence. Her lips moved as if she were speaking to the child, but no audio accompanied the footage. The woman kissed Emily's forehead, stood up, and bolted, disappearing out of frame as quickly as she had appeared. Ethan replayed the footage, leaning closer to the screen. There was something desperate in the woman's actions, something that spoke of fear rather than malice. He couldn't make out many details. Her face was partially obscured, and her clothing was plain and nondescript. Still, it was clear that she had deliberately left Emily there, hoping someone would find her. Why? Ethan muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. He sat back in his chair, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Whoever this woman was, she must have been terrified to abandon her child in such a dangerous place. But what, or who, had driven her to such an act? A small voice broke his thoughts. "Where's Mommy?" Ethan turned to see Emily sitting up on the couch, her wide blue eyes filled with confusion and a trace of fear. She clutched her rabbit tightly, her little legs swinging over the edge of the couch. Ethan knelt down in front of her, his voice gentle. "Hey there, sweetheart. I was just trying to figure that out. Do you know where your mommy is?" Emily's brows furrowed as she tried to remember. She said to wait, she whispered. She said I'd be safe. Ethan's heart ached at the simplicity of her words. "Did she tell you why she had to go?" he asked, keeping his tone soft and encouraging. Emily shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, she just hugged me and said I'd be safe." Ethan sighed, unsure of how much more to ask without overwhelming her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emily," she said quietly. "Emily Grace." "That's a beautiful name," Ethan said, offering her a small smile. "Do you know your last name, or where you live?" Emily thought for a moment before shaking her head again. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I just want Mommy." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to figure this out, okay? I promise. You're safe here with me." Emily nodded, her small hand reaching out to hold his. The gesture filled Ethan with a sense of responsibility that he hadn't felt since the day he had rescued Shadow. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he couldn't let this little girl down. Over the next few hours, Ethan reached out to local authorities, reporting Emily's discovery and sharing the camera footage of the woman who had left her. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Jenkins, arrived at the station shortly after. "This is a strange one, Ethan," Tom said as he studied the footage. "Doesn't look like the usual abandonment case. This woman looks more like she's running from something." "That's what I thought too," Ethan replied. "But she didn't leave a note or anything. Just the kid." Tom nodded grimly. "We'll run her image through our databases, see if we can identify her. In the meantime, you'll need to keep the girl here until we figure out what's going on. There aren't any immediate foster families in this area." Ethan agreed, though the thought of caring for a child, even temporarily, made him nervous. He wasn't a parent, he was a ranger. His life revolved around the wilderness, not playdates and bedtime stories. But as he glanced over at Emily, who had fallen asleep again on the couch, he felt a tug at his heart. "All right," he said finally. "I'll take care of her." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a good man, Ethan. Let's hope we get some answers soon." As the sun set over the Yellowstone Reserve, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. Shadow's protective instincts, Emily's mysterious arrival, the woman's desperate escape. Every piece of the puzzle hinted at a story far more complex and heartbreaking than he could yet imagine. Night had settled over the Yellowstone Ranger Station, casting the surrounding wilderness in deep shadows. Inside, the station glowed softly under the warm light of an old desk lamp. Ethan sat in front of his computer, replaying the footage he had discovered earlier. He couldn't shake the image of the young woman leaving Emily by the fence, her frantic demeanor etched into his mind. Who was she? And what had driven her to such a desperate act? Emily was asleep on the couch again, her small form wrapped in a thick blanket. Shadow, who had followed them back from the woods, lay just outside the station, her dark figure barely visible in the moonlight. Every so often, Ethan would glance out the window to check on her, marveling at the loyalty she displayed. It was almost as if she understood the gravity of the situation. Ethan rewound the footage once more, pausing at a frame that showed the woman's face more clearly. He leaned in, studying her features. Dark hair pulled back hastily, sharp cheekbones, and a look of sheer terror in her wide, searching eyes. Something about her seemed familiar, though Ethan couldn't quite place it. With a sigh, he opened an email he had sent to the local sheriff's office, attaching the footage and a still image of the woman. Tom Jenkins, the sheriff, had promised to run the image through facial recognition databases and missing persons reports. Ethan's phone buzzed just as he was about to close his laptop. It was Tom. "Ethan." The sheriff's gravelly voice came through the line. "I think we've got something. The woman in the footage matches a missing person out of Billings. Name's Rebecca Holloway." Ethan frowned. "Rebecca Holloway? Why does that name sound familiar?" "She's been reported missing for almost 2 weeks now," Tom explained. "But here's the twist. She's not just some random person. She's connected to a bigger case we've been keeping an eye on." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of case?" "Domestic violence," Tom said grimly. "Her ex-husband, Kevin Holloway, has a history of abuse. He's been in and out of jail, mostly for assault charges. Rebecca filed a restraining order against him a few months ago, but he violated it. When she disappeared, we suspected he had something to do with it, but we didn't have any leads. Until now." Ethan's heart sank. The fear in Rebecca's eyes from the footage suddenly made perfect sense. "You think she left Emily in the reserve to keep her safe from him?" "That's my guess," Tom replied. "If she thought he was coming after them, she might have panicked. Leaving the girl in the middle of nowhere isn't exactly ideal, but maybe she figured someone like you would find her before Kevin did." Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The situation had just become far more dangerous. "Do we know if Kevin's nearby? Could he be in the area?" "We're looking into it," Tom said. "I'll have patrols combing the outskirts of the reserve, just in case. But you need to keep an eye out too, Ethan. If this guy shows up, he's not going to be reasonable." Ethan glanced at Emily, who was still sound asleep on the couch. The thought of her being anywhere near someone like Kevin Holloway made his stomach churn. "I'll stay vigilant," he promised. "Let me know if you find anything." After hanging up, Ethan sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the new information pressing heavily on him. He turned his gaze back to the footage on his screen, this time focusing on Emily. The little girl had been through so much already, and now it was clear that her life was in even greater danger than he had initially realized. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood, instinctively reaching for the tranquilizer gun he kept nearby. Opening the door cautiously, he found Shadow sitting just outside, her yellow eyes fixed on him. She let out a low growl, her ears twitching. "What is it, girl?" Ethan asked, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. Shadow stood and began walking toward the edge of the clearing, looking back at Ethan as if urging him to follow. He hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a flashlight and followed her into the darkness. Shadow led him to the perimeter fence where Emily had been found earlier that day. Ethan scanned the ground with his flashlight, looking for anything unusual. His heart skipped a beat when he spotted fresh footprints, boot prints, to be exact. They were too large to belong to Rebecca, and they weren't Ethan's own. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He crouched to examine the tracks more closely. They were deep, indicating that whoever had made them was carrying something heavy, or moving with urgency. The prints led away from the fence, deeper into the reserve. Shadow growled again, her body tense as she sniffed the ground. Ethan rose to his feet, gripping the flashlight tightly. "If this is Kevin," he said quietly, "we've got a problem." He returned to the station, locking the door securely behind him. Emily stirred as he sat down beside her, her sleepy eyes blinking up at him. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice small and groggy. "Nothing, sweetheart," Ethan said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine." But inside, he knew that wasn't true. Somewhere out there, danger was lurking, and it was only a matter of time before it reached their doorstep. The morning sunlight streamed through the ranger station's small windows, casting warm golden streaks across the floor. Emily sat cross-legged on the couch, clutching her stuffed rabbit while nibbling on a piece of toast Ethan had prepared for her. Her wide blue eyes followed him as he moved around the station, checking maps, writing notes, and occasionally glancing toward her with a reassuring smile. Ethan had barely slept. The fresh boot prints he discovered the night before haunted him, and the knowledge that Emily's life was potentially in grave danger weighed heavily on his mind. Yet, he knew he couldn't let her see his worry. She had already been through so much. His job now was to make her feel safe. "How's the toast, kiddo?" Ethan asked, leaning against the small counter in the kitchenette. Emily looked up and gave a shy nod. "It's good," she said softly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Thank you." "You're welcome," Ethan replied, his voice warm. He walked over to the couch and crouched down to her level. "I'm going to take care of you, okay? You don't have to be scared anymore." Emily's lips quivered, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might cry. But instead, she surprised him by leaning forward and wrapping her small arms around his neck. He froze, caught off guard by the gesture, but then gently hugged her back. "You're safe here," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." Shadow, who had been lying just outside the station's front door, lifted her head and let out a low growl. Ethan glanced over, his body tensing. Shadow had been on edge all morning, her instincts clearly sensing the lingering threat. Ethan stood and peered out the window, scanning the tree line for any movement. The forest was quiet, but the unease in his gut hadn't subsided. "Emily," he said, turning back to her, "how about we go for a little walk? I'll show you around the reserve." Her face lit up at the idea. "Can Shadow come too?" Ethan hesitated. Shadow wasn't a pet. She was a wild predator, even if she seemed to have appointed herself Emily's guardian. But he couldn't deny the bond that had already formed between them, and truthfully, Shadow's presence made him feel safer too. "Yeah," he said finally. "Shadow can come." The three of them set off into the woods, Emily holding Ethan's hand tightly while Shadow walked a few steps ahead, her sleek body moving silently through the underbrush. Ethan kept the pace slow, pointing out different plants and animals as they went. "See that bird up there?" he said, gesturing to a woodpecker hammering away at a tree trunk. "That's a pileated woodpecker. They make those big holes in trees to find bugs to eat." Emily giggled. "It's so loud. Does it ever get a headache?" Ethan chuckled. "Probably not. Their heads are built for it." As they walked, Emily began to relax, her curiosity about the forest overcoming her fear. She asked questions about everything she saw: why the moss grew on one side of the trees, how the chipmunks stored their food, and whether Shadow liked chasing squirrels. Ethan answered each question patiently, grateful for the distraction. But the sense of peace was short-lived. As they neared a clearing, Shadow suddenly stopped and let out a warning growl. She crouched low, her yellow eyes fixed on the far side of the clearing. Ethan instinctively pulled Emily behind him, his hand resting on the tranquilizer gun strapped to his hip. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, scanning the area. A moment later, the bushes rustled, and a pair of deer bolted into the open, their white tails flashing as they disappeared into the trees. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It's okay," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He knelt down beside Shadow, stroking her head. "Good job. You're keeping us safe." Emily peeked out from behind Ethan. "Are the bad guys here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head, giving her a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart. Just some deer. But it's good to be careful." They returned to the station shortly after, and Ethan spent the afternoon teaching Emily how to identify animal tracks using a guidebook he kept on the shelf. She seemed to enjoy the activity, her small fingers tracing the shapes of paw prints on the pages. "That one looks like Shadow's," she said, pointing to a drawing of a mountain lion's tracks. "Pretty close," Ethan agreed. "Big cats like Shadow have pads on their feet, so their tracks look a little different from dogs or coyotes." By the time evening rolled around, Emily was visibly more at ease. She sat on the couch drawing pictures of Shadow with crayons Ethan had found in a forgotten supply closet, while he cooked a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup. As they ate, Emily looked up at him and asked, "Do you think my mommy is okay?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He set his spoon down, meeting her gaze. "I think your mommy loves you very much," he said carefully. "And I think she's doing everything she can to make sure you're safe." Emily seemed to accept this answer, though her eyes were heavy with sadness. Ethan made a silent vow to find Rebecca, no matter what it took. He owed it to Emily, and to her mother, to bring them back together. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Ethan tucked Emily into a makeshift bed he'd set up for her in one of the back rooms. Shadow curled up outside the door, her watchful presence a comforting reassurance. Ethan sat at his desk, poring over maps and reports, trying to piece together the next steps. The first days with Emily had been a whirlwind of emotions, but one thing was clear. She had already become a part of his life. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was determined to protect her. The days passed slowly in the ranger station, and Emily's presence brought an unexpected warmth to the small, rustic cabin. Her laughter echoed softly against the wooden walls as she discovered new things every day. How to skip stones in the nearby creek, how to mimic a bird's call, and even how to playfully tease Shadow, who had become her constant companion. But something about the connection between Emily and Shadow continued to intrigue Ethan. Shadow's behavior defied everything he thought he knew about wildlife. Black panthers weren't supposed to form bonds with humans, let alone act as protectors. And yet, every time Emily moved, Shadow was there, her sleek black form trailing behind like a shadow, silent, watchful, and utterly devoted. One evening, Ethan sat at his desk, poring over wildlife journals and research papers. He was trying to make sense of Shadow's behavior. Emily sat nearby, coloring a picture of Shadow under a canopy of trees. "Why does Shadow like me?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, curious, and filled with the innocence only a child could possess. Ethan looked up from his work, leaning back in his chair. "That's a good question," he said thoughtfully. "Shadow's different. She's special. I think she knows you needed someone to keep you safe." Emily tilted her head, considering this. "Like a guardian angel?" Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, maybe something like that." But deep down, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than simple instinct. Shadow wasn't just protecting Emily. She seemed to genuinely care for her. It was as if the panther saw something in the little girl that others might have missed. Later that evening, Ethan decided to test a theory. After Emily had fallen asleep, he stepped outside where Shadow lay under the stars, her yellow eyes glowing in the dim moonlight. She didn't move as he approached, her gaze fixed on the tree-line. "You've always been wild," Ethan began, speaking softly. "But I think you're more than that, aren't you?" Shadow turned her head slightly, her ears twitching as if she were listening. "You knew she was vulnerable," Ethan continued. "You could have walked away, but you didn't. Why?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but Ethan swore he saw something in her eyes, a spark of understanding, maybe even recognition. He crouched down, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied her. "I don't know how you two connected," he said, his voice low, "but whatever it is, it's keeping her alive. And for that, I owe you." Shadow blinked slowly, a motion that felt almost deliberate, before resting her head back on her paws. Ethan stood, a mixture of awe and gratitude swelling in his chest. The next day, while Emily was playing outside the station, Ethan decided to test the bond between the two. He set up a small challenge, placing Emily's stuffed rabbit near the tree-line while Shadow watched from a distance. As soon as Emily noticed her toy was missing, she ran toward the woods. Shadow immediately sprang into action, positioning herself between Emily and the deeper forest. Ethan observed from the porch, his heart pounding. "Amazing," he muttered to himself. Shadow wasn't just protective. She was actively ensuring Emily didn't wander too far. It was as though she had taken on the role of guardian completely. Later, as they sat together eating lunch, Ethan decided to broach the subject with Emily. "Do you know why Shadow follows you everywhere?" he asked casually. Emily shrugged, taking a bite of her sandwich. "She just likes me, I guess." Ethan smiled. "She does. But I think she sees something in you." "Like what?" Emily's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Strength," Ethan replied after a pause. "You've been through a lot, and you're still brave." I think Shadow respects that. Emily grinned, her cheeks dimpling. Maybe I'm her guardian angel too. Ethan laughed. Maybe you are. As the day wore on, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the bond between Emily and Shadow. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, and it gave him hope. Maybe, just maybe, this connection would be enough to keep them all safe in the days to come. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the Yellowstone wilderness in hues of orange and gold. Ethan leaned against the porch railing of the ranger station, watching Emily play with her stuffed rabbit near the edge of the clearing. Shadow sat nearby, her sleek form poised and watchful, her golden eyes never leaving the child. Ethan sighed heavily, his thoughts swirling. It had been a week since he found Emily, and the more time passed, the more attached he became. She wasn't just a lost little girl anymore. She was part of his life now. And yet, the looming decision of what to do next gnawed at him. The sheriff's office had been unable to locate Rebecca Holloway, and while Kevin's presence in the area hadn't been confirmed, Ethan couldn't shake the sense of danger. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Ethan called Sheriff Tom Jenkins. The sheriff's voice came through the line, gruff but familiar. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Tom, I need to know. What's the plan if we don't find Rebecca soon? Emily can't stay here forever." There was a pause on the other end. "I've been thinking about that too," Tom admitted. "Normally, we'd hand her over to Child Protective Services, but the nearest office is hours away, and they're already stretched thin. Plus, with Kevin still unaccounted for, sending her to a foster family could put her at even more risk." Ethan rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "So what do we do? Just keep her here indefinitely?" Tom sighed. "It's not ideal, but you're the best option she's got right now. She trusts you, Ethan. And Shadow. Hell, that panther's doing a better job protecting her than most people could." Ethan chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, Shadow's one of a kind. You ever think about making it permanent?" Tom's question came out of nowhere, catching Ethan off guard. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, though he already knew. "You're good with her," Tom said, "and it's clear she feels safe with you. If Rebecca doesn't turn up, maybe you should consider adopting her." Ethan's heart sank. The idea had crossed his mind more than once, but the reality of it seemed impossible. "Tom, I'm not a father. I don't know the first thing about raising a kid." "You're doing a damn good job so far," Tom replied. "Look, I know it's a big decision, but think about it. That little girl's been through enough. She deserves someone who cares." After hanging up, Ethan sat in silence for a long time. Could he really take on the responsibility of raising Emily? His life was built around the wild, unpredictable rhythms of the Yellowstone Reserve. It wasn't exactly the ideal environment for a child. But then he thought about Emily's laughter, her curiosity, and the way she had already adapted to the world around her. Maybe she belonged here just as much as he did. The next morning, Ethan decided to test the waters. As they ate breakfast, he broached the subject gently. "Emily, do you like it here?" She nodded enthusiastically, her mouth full of scrambled eggs. "It's the best place ever. Shadow likes it too." Ethan smiled, but his next question came with hesitation. "What if you stayed here? For a little while longer, I mean." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Really? I can stay with you and Shadow?" "If you want to," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We'd have to figure some things out, but, yeah, you could stay." Emily grinned, her small face lighting up. "I'd like that. Can Shadow stay too?" "She's not going anywhere," Ethan assured her, though he couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty. He was making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. As the days went on, Ethan began to see the possibility of a new life taking shape. Emily had a resilience that inspired him, and her bond with Shadow only deepened. But the fear of Kevin Holloway still loomed in the back of his mind. He couldn't protect her forever, not without knowing more about the danger that followed her. One evening, as Ethan tucked Emily into bed, she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Are you my new daddy now?" Ethan froze, his hand lingering on the edge of her blanket. He met her gaze, her blue eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. "Emily, I don't know if I can be your daddy, but I'll always be here for you, okay? No matter what." Emily seemed to accept this, nodding as she hugged her stuffed rabbit. Okay. As she drifted off to sleep, Ethan sat beside her for a while, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Emily. Whatever it took, he would protect her, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to give her the family she deserved. The days began to blend into a new rhythm at the Yellowstone Ranger Station. Mornings were filled with the chirping of birds and the distant rustle of the wind through the pines. Emily had adapted quickly to life in the wilderness, her natural curiosity shining through in every activity. For Ethan, it was both heartwarming and bittersweet to watch her flourish, knowing the precariousness of their situation. Shadow had fully embraced her role as protector, following Emily wherever she went. The sleek Black Panther's presence was a constant source of fascination and comfort for the little girl. Ethan often watched from the porch as Emily ran around the clearing, laughing as Shadow padded silently beside her, a patient sentinel. Their bond was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, and it made him wonder if fate had brought them together for a reason. One afternoon, Ethan decided to take Emily on a more structured exploration of the reserve. He packed a small backpack with snacks, water, and a first aid kit and led her down a well-worn trail that wound through the forest. Shadow followed closely, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. "Where are we going today?" Emily asked, skipping along the path. "There's a meadow up ahead where a lot of animals like to gather," Ethan explained. "If we're quiet, we might see some elk or maybe even a moose." Emily's eyes widened. "A moose? Are they big?" "Very big," Ethan said with a smile. "But don't worry, they're gentle as long as we give them space." When they reached the meadow, Emily's excitement bubbled over as she spotted a group of elk grazing near the edge of the trees. She crouched down beside Ethan, her small hand gripping his arm. "They're so pretty," she whispered. "They are," Ethan agreed. "This is their home, just like the ranger station is ours right now. We have to respect it and take care of it." Emily nodded solemnly, her expression thoughtful. "I'll take care of it, too." As they sat there, Ethan couldn't help but notice how natural Emily seemed in this environment. Most children her age would have been overwhelmed or frightened by the isolation and unpredictability of the wilderness, but Emily had embraced it. She was curious, resilient, and quick to adapt, a testament to her strength even at such a young age. Later that evening, back at the station, Emily helped Ethan prepare dinner. It was a simple meal, grilled chicken, rice, and steamed vegetables. But Emily treated it like an adventure, carefully arranging the plates and stirring the rice with exaggerated concentration. "I'm a chef," she declared proudly, her face lighting up as she handed Ethan a plate. "You sure are," Ethan said with a chuckle. "And a good one at that." As they ate, Emily asked questions about the animals in the reserve, her curiosity seemingly endless. "Do you think Shadow had a family before she met us?" she asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Ethan paused, considering his answer. "She did," he said gently. "But sometimes things happen that we can't control, and animals like Shadow have to learn to survive on their own. Just like you're learning to be strong now." Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on her plate. "But she's not alone anymore, right? She has us." "That's right," Ethan said, feeling a lump form in his throat. "She has us." As the days turned into weeks, Emily and Ethan began to settle into a routine. Mornings were spent exploring the forest, afternoons were filled with stories and games, and evenings often ended with Shadow curled up near Emily's bed, her presence a silent reassurance. But beneath the surface, Ethan's worries lingered. Every time he checked the perimeter of the station or scanned the camera feeds, he was reminded of the danger that still loomed. Kevin Holloway was out there somewhere, and until he was caught, Ethan knew their peace was fragile. One evening, as they sat by the campfire Ethan had built just outside the station, Emily turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "Do you think my mommy will come back?" Ethan's heart ached at the hope in her voice. He poked at the fire with his stick, buying himself a moment to think. "I hope so, Emily," he said finally. "But no matter what happens, you have me, and Shadow. We'll always look out for you." Emily seemed to accept this, leaning her head against his arm as they watched the flames dance in the dark. Shadow lay nearby, her golden eyes reflecting the firelight, a silent reminder of the bond that had brought them all together. For Ethan, these quiet moments were bittersweet. He knew the life they had built was temporary, but he couldn't help imagining a future where it wasn't. Emily deserved stability, safety, and a family, and for the first time, Ethan began to wonder if he could be the one to give her that. The day Ethan had both anticipated and dreaded arrived sooner than he expected. A call came from Sheriff Tom Jenkins early one morning, breaking the routine calm of the ranger station. Ethan answered with a mix of apprehension and hope, his voice steady but laced with tension. "We found Rebecca Holloway," Tom announced without preamble. "She's alive." Ethan froze, the weight of the news hitting him like a thunderclap. "Where is she?" he asked, gripping the phone tightly. "She turned herself in at a women's shelter in Billings last night," Tom explained. "She was running from Kevin, just like we thought. She's been through hell, Ethan."
"She's scared, but she's asking for her daughter."
Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing toward the back room where Emily was playing with Shadow. "Does Kevin know where she is?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "We don't think so," Tom said. "But he's still out there, and until we find him, she and Emily won't be completely safe." The news left Ethan conflicted. On one hand, Rebecca's return was what he had been hoping for. Emily deserved to be reunited with her mother. On the other hand, the thought of letting her go filled him with a sense of loss he hadn't expected. "When does she want to see Emily?" Ethan asked finally. "Soon," Tom replied. "She's willing to come to the station if you're okay with it." Ethan nodded, even though Tom couldn't see him. "Yeah, tell her to come." The hours that followed were a blur of preparation and emotion. Ethan didn't tell Emily about Rebecca right away. He wanted to give her time to adjust to the idea. Instead, he focused on making the station feel warm and welcoming, as if that might somehow make the reunion easier. When Rebecca arrived later that afternoon, Ethan was struck by how frail she looked. She was a small woman, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid and tired eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unrelenting fear. But there was a quiet determination in her posture, a strength that reminded Ethan of Emily. "Thank you for taking care of her," Rebecca said softly as she stepped inside. Her voice trembled, but her gratitude was genuine. "I didn't know what else to do." Ethan shook his head. "You did what you had to do to keep her safe.
That's all that matters."
Rebecca's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Emily, who stood hesitantly near the couch with Shadow at her side. "Emily," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. Emily's face lit up with recognition, but she didn't move right away. She looked up at Ethan, as if seeking his reassurance. "It's okay, Emily," Ethan said gently. "That's your mommy." The little girl took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was running into Rebecca's arms. The two of them clung to each other, Rebecca's tears soaking into Emily's hair as she whispered words of love and apology. "I missed you so much, sweetheart," Rebecca said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry I had to leave you. I love you more than anything." "I missed you too, Mommy," Emily replied, her small voice muffled against Rebecca's shoulder. Ethan watched the reunion from a distance, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. He was relieved for Emily, but a part of him ached at the thought of saying goodbye. Shadow, who had been watching quietly, padded over to stand beside Ethan. The panther's presence was a comfort, as if she sensed his inner turmoil. Later, as Rebecca and Emily sat together, catching up, Rebecca turned to Ethan. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You gave her a home when I couldn't. I'll never forget that." Ethan nodded, his voice quiet. "She's an incredible kid. She gave me just as much as I gave her." Rebecca hesitated, then added, "I know this is a lot to ask, but would you consider staying in her life? She talks about you all the time, and it's clear she feels safe with you. I don't want to take that away from her." Ethan was taken aback. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice tinged with surprise. "You don't think it'll confuse her?" Rebecca shook her head. "No. If anything, it'll help her. She's been through so much already, and she needs all the stability she can get." Ethan glanced at Emily, who was now giggling as she played with Shadow. His heart swelled with a mix of pride and gratitude. "I'd be honored," he said. Over the next few days, Ethan worked with Rebecca to transition Emily back into her care. They stayed at the ranger station for a while longer, giving Emily time to adjust to the changes. Shadow remained a constant presence, her calm demeanor a grounding force for everyone. When the day came for Rebecca and Emily to leave, the goodbye was bittersweet. Emily hugged Ethan tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "I'm going to miss you," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll miss you too, kiddo," Ethan replied, his throat tight. "But this isn't goodbye. I'll see you again soon, okay?" Emily nodded, her tears soaking into his shirt. "Okay." As they drove away, Ethan stood on the porch with Shadow at his side, watching until their car disappeared down the dirt road. The station felt quieter, emptier, but Ethan knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, for all of them. Shadow let out a low rumble, her golden eyes meeting Ethan's. He smiled, placing a hand on her sleek head. "Well, girl," he said, his voice steady, "I guess we've got work to do." With that, they turned back toward the wilderness, ready to face whatever came next, together. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and if you've watched until here, comment, "I watched until here," and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's super exciting.